So my name is Laurence Cardaya. I'm a postdoc here at CCS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the ninth and final presentation in the new lecture series of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies for winter term 2016. The lecture series will resume in the fall 2016 semester, and the schedule will be available at the beginning of that term. So just a couple announcements to start. On Wednesday, April 13th, that is to say tomorrow, the LRCCS Tangjuni lecture series will present Sonia Oswey, also a postdoctoral fellow at the China Center. She'll be speaking on overcoming communicative discontinuities and the possibility of teaching a skill in the Zhuangzi. The talk will take place at 4 p.m. in room 2022 of the South Layer building, and a reception will follow in the main lobby. At this point, we'd appreciate it if you could take a second to turn off your cell phones before the talk begins. All right, so today's presentation will be given by Andrea Bachner, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Cornell University. Her research explores comparative intersections between Sinophone, Latin American, and European cultural productions in dialogue with theories of interculturality, sexuality, and mediality. Her first book, Beyond Sinology, Chinese Writing and the Scripts of Cultures, analyzes how the Chinese script has been imagined in recent decades in literature and film, visual and performance art, design, and architecture, both within Chinese cultural contexts and in different parts of the quote-unquote West. She is the co-editor with Carlos Rojas of the Oxford Handbook of Modern Chinese Literatures, which is forthcoming, and has published articles in Comparative Literature, Comparative Literature Studies, Concentric, German Quarterly, Modern Chinese Literature and Culture, Taller de Letras, as well as in several edited volumes. She has just completed the genealogy of the concept of inscription that probes the media imaginaries of poststructuralist theory, and is currently working on a reflection on the limits of comparison through an exploration of the rich history of cultural contact, exchange, and affinity between Latin American and Chinese cultures from the late 19th century to today. Today she will be speaking on violent media beyond the stereotype of Chinese cruelty. Please join me in welcoming Andrea Bachner.
Thank you, Laurence. Thanks for having me. It's a privilege to share some of my work here, and this is a fantastic turnout. I hope that some of the very graphic material I'm showing is not going to interfere with your enjoyment of your lunches, right? Because after all, the topic here is violence, and so let me begin. So what I'm presenting, what I'm sharing with you is part of a book that reflects on the methodology and ethics of intercultural analysis through the lens of interactions between and comparisons of cultural articulations from Latin America and the Sinophone world. Of course, appropriate to the context here, I will focus on Sinophone material only, but the conceptual questions really remain the same. Even though I'm mapping only one intercultural movement in what follows, namely a pattern of an uneven feedback looping between China and Europe and then back to China or the Chinese cultural world at large. The crucial question I attempt to address is the function of representations of extreme violence as they circulate between different cultures on the one hand, and as we, as critics, use them in the context of intercultural comparative analyses on the other. As French philosopher Etienne Balibar points out, extreme violence or cruelty emerges frequently in liminal spaces, such as the borders between different cultures. But extreme violence is not only a phenomenon of intercultural contact gone wrong, but also one that, by way of representation, forges imaginaries of cultural difference, often in highly problematic and indeed discursively violent ways. Cruelty is always an attribute of the other, the total other, a sign of difference, incommensurability, even of inhumanity. On the other hand, the singularity of cruelty, of such extreme violence, precisely because it serves often as discursive ideological aim of cultural othering, has to be circulated obsessively. It has to signify, as well as remaining, that which human understanding cannot grasp. So hence, representations of extreme violence as a means of assigning difference are thus from the outset subject to ambivalent strategies. And yet this does not hinder their functioning. In fact, representational practices, as the ones I'm going to present on today, that contest such a use, are themselves in danger of perpetuating the exemplary force of violent tropes. So, some examples of tropes of extreme violence have proven particularly virulent, prone to wide circulations across time, cultures, and media. For instance, one that Mexican writer Salvador Elizondo describes as a, quote, a world-shattering vision. The photographs of Ling, or death by 1,000 cuts. This Chinese execution technique that consisted in a series of increasingly severe bodily cuts was reserved for the most atrocious of crimes, such as parricide or the murder of a whole family in the Qing Penal Code, and it was officially abolished in 1905. And yet, even as the practice was no longer deemed adequate for China's present, its last vestiges began to capture a Western imaginary of China. Frozen in time by the new medium of photography, images of the last 3 executions of Ling, which were probably taken by Westerners in China in the aftermath of the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion by the Allied forces, proliferated, commodified in postcards, memorabilia, used to spice up travelogues of China, or even to illustrate treatises on physiology. These images not only became the object of voyeuristic and sensational pleasure, they also helped cement the vision of the cruel Chinese, a stereotype that cast China into a barbaric past, for instance, in a chapter called Chinese Horrors in Henry Norman's travelogue, with its description of China's judicial system as based on arbitrary decisions, torture, and violent executions. Cruelty is a marker of otherness, covers up the pleasure the European subject derives from the display of alterity, but more importantly, with its dichotomy between the modern and the barbaric, it elides colonial violence. In the 1960s, when French philosopher Georges Bataille features Ling as the center of his discussion of eroticism in the last chapter in Tears of Eros, Chinese cruelty accretes a different meaning, no longer part and parcel of a despised cultural difference, but a sublime example of ecstatic violence as an important reference for the sovereign subject. While featuring images from different Ling series, Bataille singles out one image, this one in particular, one which he claimed with which he claimed a particularly intimate relationship of ownership, since supposedly it had been given to him as a gift by his psychoanalyst Borel. Bataille writes, it might actually not be true, right? But Bataille writes about this photograph, quote, "This photograph had a decisive role in my life. I've never stopped being obsessed by this image of pain, at once ecstatic and intolerable," end of quote. Even though Bataille rewrites the valence of violence, the suffering body in the picture is equally objectified. Where Henry Norman had erased Chinese suffering as a cipher, mere cipher for Chinese barbarity, Bataille erases Chinese suffering by making the scene always already about the gaze of a Western male subject and his ecstatic epiphany. In what follows then, I will focus on two examples that showcase how writers and artists from a Chinese cultural sphere write back or indeed remediate the stereotype of Chinese cruelty. The first is the work of Taiwanese artist Chen Chieh-jen of the late 1990s and early 2000s. And the second example is the novel Tan Xiangxing, or Sandalwood Torture or Death, by PRC author Mo Yan, which was published in 2001. In addition to dialoguing with Western interest in Chinese execution practices, these writers, artists also dialogue inevitably with Lu Xun, right, who famously inscribed himself into the colonial discourse on the cruel Chinese in the 1922 preface to the collection A Call to Arms, forced to witness the execution of a Chinese at the hands of the Japanese during the Russo-Japanese War in a lantern slide in a mediated form, right, at the end of a lesson on microbiology. What impressed and impacted Lu Xun is not the violence of the execution. This is a photo that, not the lantern slide that Lu Xun saw, but something similar maybe. So he was not impressed by the violence of the execution at the hands of the Japanese, but by the lethargy of the Chinese bystanders, right? And this visual epiphany, which we're all pretty familiar with, hinges upon a paradoxical detachment from his fellow countrymen as Lu Xun translates colonial cruelty from the Japanese executioners to the passive gaze of Chinese bystanders in the scene. So Mo Yan and Chen Chieh-jen imagine different scenes of violence, different scenes for the trope of Ling, and for the photograph, or the kind of photograph that obsessed Bataille. They face the challenge of coming to terms aesthetically as well as ethically with a European tradition, right, that both revels in and abjects Chinese culture through the lens of cruelty, as well as with the complexly ambivalent Chinese tradition that links visuality, violence, and national disempowerment. As such, they have to find ways that neither enshrine Ling yet again as the ultimate exemplar of cruelty, nor relativize it as just another instance of violence. So my first example, Taiwanese artist Chen Chieh-jen undertakes an obsessively repetitive exploration of the very photograph that occupied such a central place in Bataille's The Tears of Eros. His 1996 piece, Genealogy of Self, Ben Sheng Tu, for instance, not only inserts Chen's image into the scene of cruelty, yes, this guy actually, okay, it also transgresses photographic verisimilitude by doubling the head of the execution victim. The very face that inspired Bataille to reflect on ecstasy becomes, in Chen's photo montage, a two-headed monster. The body in pieces perversely supplemented by inhuman excess. Genealogy of Self ushers in a reflection on the seriality of violent representation, one that Chen will explore more in depth in the Ling themed video piece that I'm focusing on, namely Ling Echoes of a Historical Photograph of 2002. The Chinese title is Ling Kao. And this makes Bataille's photo the centerpiece of an entire performance. The performance consists of a video of 25 minutes and is presented as an installation on 3 contiguous screens. It singles out the photograph as a crystallizing point, but actually brings it into an unceasing economy of repetition. Chen's piece carefully recreates a Ling sequence, but it's the absence of sound, it's very slow pace, and an aesthetics of indirection. You never really see the cut. It's not a gore movie, really, right? Makes the piece not enact a spectacular cruelty. Rather, it understands itself as an analysis, a genealogy, or in the Chinese title, a Kao, right? An examination of Ling. Now, Chen's video engages in a study of spectatorship, thus drawing attention to the act of capturing Chinese atrocities on supposedly European film. The stereoscopic camera, with its double lenses that is featured in the video, becomes one of the main foci of the piece. stereoscopy was one of the preferred technologies for rendering images more realistic at end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, since with a slightly three-dimensional effect, it effectively doubles an image by way of a slight, calculated perspectival difference between two photographs. Now, Chen's emphasis on the specific visual technology zooms in on the mediation, the photographic reproduction and consumption of these images. The factual doubled camera lens in this piece echoes the monstrous bicephalous figure of genealogy of self, and it underscores the excessive proliferation at all levels of the visual circulation of Ling. In Chen's piece, the camera then becomes a tool of violence, but the video also offers spectators the vision of an alternative scopic technology, the victim's wounds, right? So you see here how we have a visual echo between the double lenses and the double wounds, the double breast wounds. The victim's breast wounds provide a visual echo of the double camera lenses, thus suggesting an analogy between visual technology and bodily fragmentation, a sequence in which the double wounds as corporeal holes, as fissures in the fabric of reality, function as visual lenses. We actually see through them, right? Reverses the visual focus from the objectified body of the victim to the gazes of the spectators and of the stereoscopic camera in the scene. The wounds and not the victim's eyes become the means for gazing back, right? For providing us potentially a different kind of access to this scene. And this is something that Chen Chieh-jen remarks upon in one of his comments. I won't read it. But if we were to read the wound as an entryway into a scene of violence, then the visual access granted us spectators to the wounds in Ling also engages us in a double play in and around the representation of violence. On one hand, it suggests a more direct connection to the image, quite literally leading our gaze into the wounds that would otherwise merely remain two-dimensional stains, something to be gazed at, not taken into consideration beyond that. On the other, this conduit into the image of violence also highlights its mediated nature. Even through the wounds, our own vision remains circumscribed by medial blinders, and although the defamiliarized perspective in the video allows for a reflection on the politics of visual representation, it still frames the possibility for empathy, for an ethical type of spectatorship in precarious ways. After all, the filmic sleight of hand of the wounds-turned camera lenses cannot facilitate our communion with the suffering in the scene any more than Bataille's insistence on his immediate reaction, ecstatic reaction to the photograph. And even as we are made to gaze through the wounds become lenses, we also look at the figure of the victim, right? So we gaze supposedly through the wounds, but gaze at the victim also, right? Standing within a group of spectators. There where we expect to behold the singular spectacle of violence, Chen's video always meets our gaze with yet another hallucinatory double. The constant effects of doubling throughout this piece effectively preclude any possibility of direct access to the pain or violence in the scene. In fact, even the images of spectators on the scene change constantly. Only in some of the sequence that the camera films from the perspective of the simulated breast wounds do the bystanders actually resemble the bystanders in the photograph that interested Bataille so much. In all other instances, the audience that Chen stages consists of figures who face the camera with a half-defiant, half-sad gaze, at times a group of men, at times a group of women who wear contemporary garb, and these are actually victims of another type of violence, laid-off workers of a Taiwanese factory. The anachronistic presence of a group of modern-day female figures opens Chen's video up to a series of other violent acts. Chen's tradition of horrors that radiates from but also relativizes Ling enters the scene in the form of a series of stills, the ones you have here, or some of them, disconnected by filmic fade-outs. And these are sites of atrocities. The ruins of the old summer palace in Beijing, destroyed by colonial forces, a site in Harbin in which the Japanese conducted experiments with Chinese prisoners, the Green Island prison in Taiwan, an internment camp for dissidents after the 228 incident in Taiwan, and a Taiwanese factory site of environmental contamination. Now I'm featuring just some of them here. Chen's piece thus not only provides different perspectives on the scene frozen in a photograph, but endlessly reproduced by technology, of course, but offers also a different way of reading the execution as one in a series of dramatic events. The distinct, the singular, becomes a stand-in for images of a whole series of atrocities, from colonial violence in China to environmental catastrophe to the effects of a neoliberal economy. The Ling photograph then singularizes violence, so without personalizing it. After all, the unnamed figure of the victim, and we don't know the name of the victim actually in the original photograph series, while we do know the names of the victims in some other series. But the victim's pain never simply signifies his pain only. It's always already something that is resignified and placed in circulation. In contrast, the visual interpretations of sites of violence serve as reminders for those who know how to read them of the mainly untold stories of collective suffering. The images do not directly represent atrocities, right? No violence here that's represented, but remind us of sites that have been marked by violence, but in which these marks are no longer visible. Only the juxtaposition with the enactment of Ling prompts us to read these slightly eerie images as tied to violence. This arrangement highlights the paradox inherent in the technologically mediated scenario of cruelty. Although cruelty, such as the one embodied in Ling, insists on the heterogeneity of a scene that stands outside of signification, reality, normalcy, a critical perspective on cruel representations must re-establish a framework of comparison that also risks eliding the singularity of violence. A montage of references to acts of violence tied to different times and spaces brought into close contiguity in the filmic series establishes an analogical constellation in which the comparative series erases the unspeakably singular. However, this also points to the fact that violence and cruelty has always been serialized, even in the initial photograph. So instead of circumventing the conceptual and indeed ethical problem of the singular seriality of violence, Chen draws attention to it by insisting on repetition. The Ling image that supposedly haunted Bataille and for which Chen produces echoes or rather after images is always already duplicitous from the double distorted vision of the stereoscope to the installation, right? You see here some of the effect in those stills of the way in which the video piece was screened on 3 contiguous screens, thus introducing a further phenomenon of repetition, a triplification, almost like a kind of like triptych. The duplicitous visuality highlighted in the video is dribbled in Chen's installation. As a dynamic triptych, it establishes a law of the series that connects different traumatic events, a logic of doubling that is also cutting up of or disjunction of one in the same image, an interplay of dismemberment, also on the level of montage, and remembrance. This is, of course, a false etymology, but still I think it's a quite suggestive one, right? As a connection of different moments in the past, different images through visually added memory, which brings me to my second example, which works very differently, namely the novel Sandalwood Death by Chinese novelist Mo Yan, that returns its reader to the time of the Boxer Rebellion. The novel takes the form of an operatic tradition local to Mo Yan's home region, the Maoqiang or cat tone opera, right, for its imitation of animal sounds. Thus, as the author remarks, he's taking a great leap backwards, away from Western models of the novel and on a quest to recuperate the vitality of oral storytelling and folk performance. not only is each part of the novel framed as the narration and voice of one of the main characters, each is also prefaced and indeed permeated by lines of opera and the constant wailing meow of the cat tone. The novel's plot, staged in this polyphony, is told really quickly. At the time of the Boxer Rebellion, with local hero, legendary cat tone performer Sun Bing, he kills a German railway technician who had molested his wife, becomes a fugitive, joins the Boxers. When he's captured, Chinese General Yuan Shikai, the Germans' loyal ally, right, and General von Ketteler, the German plenipotentiary, demand that Sun Bing undergo an exemplary punishment, the Sandalwood Execution of the title. This is a protracted death by slow impalement. However, a cat tone performance to honor Sun Bing during his execution turns into a massacre, and the district official Qian shows his resistance against colonialism and the collusion of Chinese powers with the Germans by stabbing Sun Bing and sparing him thus further suffering. The novel is shot through with violent images, from massacres to drawn-out descriptions of different execution methods: beheading, impalement, right, sandalwood punishment, skull crushing, cutting in two, and indeed Ling. For the victim of the sandalwood impalement, Sun Bing, his staged execution becomes an opportunity, a spectacle, right, to enter the realm of the cat tone opera, and indeed execution and spectacle and performance are constantly equated throughout the novel. But this polyphonous text also allows Mo Yan to debunk Western stereotypes of Chinese cruelty, not only to spectacularly reproduce some of those scenes. The ingenious technology of pain that is the sandalwood execution of the title is not the invention of any one culture, but emerges through an act of translation in the conversation between the German plenipotentiary von Ketteler and the executioner, and this is brokered by a translator, right? You can read the quote for yourself, but I'll comment on it. So the sandalwood death as ultimate cruel technology emerges from the depth of the Chinese executioner's memory, a myth-like reminiscence. But it is prompted by von Ketteler's descent into his own culture's archive of atrocity, namely crucifixion, right? That the Chinese text leaves it ambiguous if the punishment by way of stake, this is my very sort of awkward rendering of Baren Ding Zai Mu Zhuang Shang, right, which can be read as somebody is nailed to a stake or impaled upon a stake. So it's actually ambivalent if we can call this crucifixion or impalement, underlines the hybridity of the sandalwood death. It speaks to the fundamentally hybrid nature of imaginaries of cruelty, even when one culture reimagines another culture's atrocities. With the gesture of placing the sandalwood impalement rather than Ling at the center of a novel about China at the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, and of framing it in a transcultural collusion under the sign of colonialism, Mo Yan already marks a distance from Western infatuations with Ling, even though the novel also, of course, contains a scene of Ling. But the shift from Ling to impalement is not the only mechanism of displacing assumptions about the cultural specificity of cruel imaginaries. The text's constant concern with sound also contests the overwhelmingly visual figures of Western renderings of Chinese cruelty, especially the medium of photography that had been so prominent in the circulation of these early photographs. As a gesture of resistance against German colonial power and Chinese collaboration, the district magistrate kills Sun Bing before the sandalwood execution reaches its end. Sun Bing is supposed to be kept alive, impaled, for 5 days until the arrival of the first train on the newly finished railroad from Qingdao to Gaomi, that Sun Bing attempted to sabotage with his Boxer comrades. But Sun Bing dies before this memorable event, and thus the photographer on the train sent to capture Sun Bing's suffering and demise on filmic plate arrives too late. Rather than living on, right, as a victimized body and cipher of colonial power and alleged Chinese cruelty in the indefinitely circulating freeze frame of a photograph, Sun Bing remains alive to a certain extent or at least this is what the novel suggests, as incessantly reactivated part of his community's performance tradition, the cat-tone opera. The Sandalwood death thus responds to a whole tradition of Western circulation of Chinese cruelty by reinventing a past in which photography failed to produce a vision of Chinese horrors, right? At least in this one instance, right? It toys with an alternative reality in which Bataille's picture, or at least a picture like the one that Bataille claimed to be obsessed with, would never have been taken. In Mo Yan's novel, then, sound becomes the medium that precariously mediates between Chinese and German culture in the novel. Through the lens of its multiple narrators, the novel incessantly differentiates between Chinese as intelligible, correct, and civilized speech vis-a-vis the gibberish of the German other, right, such as the onomatopoetic transliteration of how von Ketteler's speech sounds to the Chinese listener, right, what Goldblatt translated as chabad, right, a gulu sound, right, or here, right, in this, it's a kind of, where von Ketteler actually speaks Chinese, right, it's a kind of repetitive Chinese, right, how, something like that, right. So the German other doesn't quite speak in a civilized tongue, right? We could even say that the gulu, right, is something like the bar, right, which of course in Greek is a way of mimicking the speech that is non-Greek and hence allocate non-civility or non-culture in the other. And yet, the language of the colonial power also acquires the status of an alien sonic technology. According to local hearsay in the novel, Chinese boys who are taken away by the Germans to be educated in missionary schools have to have their tongues altered before being able to utter the sounds of an alien language, right, a 贵子话. So in order to be able to be taught to speak German, they have to undergo an operation that cuts some part of the tongue, right? So they have to have their tongue 舌头, like they need to undergo 修国舌头, right? They are called in the post phase where Mo Yan actually returns to that scene, right, as people who had their tongues trimmed, 修国舌头的, right? The rumor that Chinese have to have their tongues cut to make suitable instruments for producing and reproducing the other language embodies a corporeal metaphor of Chinese subjugation, such as the tails cut off, which also features prominently in the novel. But this is a paradoxical metaphor. The imbalance of power between colonized Chinese and German colonizers is counteracted by a logic of lack. If Chinese tongues have to be cut to speak German, then do German tongues have to be treated in a similar way, or are they naturally lacking something in comparison to Chinese tongues? So Mo Yan's tale of Chinese superstition in the face of cultural difference and colonial oppression marks a sly, sonic counterpoint to another important text by Lu Xun, namely his essay on photography, 论照相之类, whereas Lu Xun ironically reproduces the Chinese belief that the Western technology of photography uses Chinese eyes as raw material, preserved as if pickled. Right? The West's means of communication, namely the use of native translators, depends on the partial amputation or castration of Chinese tongues. Mo Yan echoes Lu Xun's on photography, but by underlining that colonial power alters and effectively feeds on the bodies of its colonized subjects. And yet, as Mo Yan provides a sonic pendant of sorts, he also switches medium from the freeze frame of photography, which according to another of the superstitions recounted by Lu Xun in On Photography, was perceived as a violent medium with photos taken only of the upper body likened to execution by being cut in two, right? To sound technology, right? So this transmediation from visuality to sound. But even with the change of image to sound, mediation is no less violent here. If the photograph symbolically cuts a body, not only but especially whenever it frames the Chinese, by way of the extremes of a body in pain on the one hand and a cruel executioner on the other, speech in translation also depends on a physical cut, or so the Chinese rumor has it, as described in Sandalwood Death, a cut of the tongue. The strategy then of writing back against Western representations of Chinese atrocities, as well as some modern Chinese reflections on the same topic, espoused in Sandalwood Death is twofold. Firstly, the novel's insistence on the hybrid origin of the Sandalwood execution disclaims the existence of any specifically Chinese type of violence. Secondly, by not allowing the photograph that would turn Sun Bing into a suffering exemplar of colonial power and Chinese cruelty to happen, as well as by echoing Lu Xun's reflections on visuality in the realm of sound, Mo Yan's novel turns away from the visual medium of photography so prominent in reflections on Chinese execution methods and seeks in sound a master medium of cultural memory and novelistic creation. I want to offer some very brief conclusions. I want to read Chen's work and Mo Yan's novel not merely as examples, as objects of analysis, but as theories about how to represent extreme violence and on how to analyze representations of extreme violence. So according to a meta perspective. For a Chinese novelist such as Mo Yan or a Taiwanese artist such as Chen Chieh-jen, Ling cannot stand as the ultimate exemplar of cruelty, since such a conceptual exaltation would cement the absolute alterity of Chinese culture produced through its link with Ling. And yet, Ling cannot be relativized simply by presenting other culturally specific examples of extreme violence either, right? Almost as a kind of dialectics of culturally codified violence, if you so want, right? So saying, oh, it's not Ling, but say a Western type of violence, right? Instead, Mo Yan and Chen reappropriate Ling as a means of reflecting on the stakes of the representation of extreme violence as an ethical and an intercultural problem. So how can we remember a tradition of violence without turning it into a cipher of cultural incommensurability? And how can extreme violence and suffering be represented in an ethically responsible way, one that does not flatten or erase suffering, but one that does not enshrine such suffering as absolute, ineffable, singular either? Mo Yan's and Chen's responses to these conceptual challenges are similar, even though they work in and with very different media and media imaginaries. Sound and text in Mo Yan, and video, image, and installation in Chen. When faced with scenes of extreme violence, representation has to reflect on the force of mediality. In other words, the media in which scenes of extreme violence are captured and circulated matter profoundly. By framing violence, they influence how we view and react to representations of extreme violence. Will we be sensitive to pain and suffering, or will we objectify or even relish them as spectacles? Will we use suffering as a discursive weapon, for instance, by casting another culture into the realm of the barely human? Or will it move us to see the human condition as one of vulnerability, and thus as an injunction to an ethics based on a shared humanity, as well as to an ethical use of intercultural analysis? And I'm happy I ended a little bit early so that we have plenty of time for Q&A. Yes, please.
To get to something that you said right at the end, I'm interested in how the audience, I don't want to use the word audience, but the spectators reacted to these types of executions. I know that in England, it was not uncommon when there were hangings, public hangings, for people to bring their lunches, and there was a very rowdy. On the other hand, you have the execution late in the terror in France of Madame Bovary, because of her very loud screams, because she pleaded with the executioners to let her go just one more. And then it was said that there was complete silence in the trial, which was completely a complete break with what, because they saw at last just a terrified woman instead of these nobles. Could you comment on the reaction of spectators? Were they rowdy, or were they moved?
Of course, we get the reactions of spectators only through accounts, and these accounts are invariably very tendentious. Right? For example, Henry Norman would give, in his Chinese horrors, would give a very detailed picture of the crowds at these executions. And it was, of course, framing these crowds as either absolutely indifferent and lethargic, or as actually enjoying the spectacle. And so having this like kind of like rowdy kind of pleasure experience. And you see that, and I think I talked about it a little bit, how, of course, in his performance art, Chen really reframes the picture of spectatorship. You see it a little bit here, in terms of people who gaze back defiantly at the camera, so who are not colluding. Some of them are colluding, right, but then you get other spectators who are not colluding. But I think all these are actually imaginations of what an audience reaction should be like. So they are always already overdetermined by, I think, what we want to express. With so I can't reconstruct really a scene, and very likely, I think, as you hinted at in your own question, those reactions must have been extremely different depending on the situation, depending on each particular individual in the audience. But it's an extremely interesting thing to look at, especially how spectatorship is represented, and how that can help us or not help us then maybe mimic our own spectatorship as a more ethically responsible or not kind of spectatorship. Yes?
Who
Thank
were
you.
the spectators? Is it open to everybody wanted to come and
You're talking about the original Ling executions. Yeah, so, there's a very, very good book by Bourgon and Billings, Death by a Thousand Cuts, which really investigates this whole tradition and presents a lot of details. So if you want to have a closer look, please have a look at the book. But these were, at least what we know of the three last executions, these were actually staged in not very sort of like distinctive and very, very crowded places. So they were not even sort of set apart almost as a theater, but it was just on a kind of like market square. And so you see in the photograph, let's see, a little bit of the kind of like way in which spectators really crowd around, right? So it was, and I think access to these scenes was not really policed, even though some Europeans claim that they were actually prohibited from being at those executions. And for example, Henry Norman, who takes, so this is one of the earliest photographs of Ling, which is only the final part of the already dismembered body. So Henry Norman claims that this was taken by an English sailor who really had to sort of like snatch this photograph because he was actually prohibited from being there. But then everything suggests that in order to take photographs of, and this is just one photograph in a series of various photographs of the same execution, and there are three complete series of that there must have been a photographer who was permitted to actually be there, and very, very likely historians reconstruct that this was at least partly probably a Western photography, probably French.
So for the Chinese, it's almost like entertainment.
Yeah,
Gladiators.
kind of, yeah. But again, right, coming back to the first question, we don't really know, right? I mean, how are we to read the faces of the spectators in those photographs? They are open to so many interpretations, right? We could read them as lethargic. We could read them as really interested in the spectacle. We could read them as maybe even with a look of disgust. It's really open to so many interpretations. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I really like, I mean, this is obviously an intercultural comparative project, and I really like the way that you helped us to understand the context of Yan and Chen Chieh-jen's project, so them being contestations of these representations is like the world of which they're speaking, and they have a specific goal, I think, in the ways that they're representing the scenes. I wasn't
Yes.
reaction. So to me, that suggests that maybe Bataille is interested in critiquing his own reaction to it, and so I feel like to make an equal comparison, we need to also understand what these kinds of things
Yeah.
are.
No, absolutely. And this is a very important part of this whole chapter, as well as then a part on how Latin American authors, especially in the 1960s, especially drawing on Bataille, reframe, rewrite Chinese cruelty in yet another way. Bataille's reaction to Ling is very complex, because at least to some extent, I think his claim of being personally moved and impacted, and this having a kind of ecstatic impact on him, seems to be definitely a kind of textual representation, a kind of persona, right? Because it really connected extremely well to his thought on eroticism and the way in which extreme violence and sexual arousal were connected to a situation in which the sovereign subject emerged, right, to something that was outside of the normal sort of downplayed reality of his times, right? So he had a very, very positive use for these images, and actually he discussed these images in several of his works, but his discussion also changes slightly from reference to reference, and he comes to these images already through a whole tradition of these images being used in especially treatises on physiology, travelogues, etc. And he even reads and rewrites some of the references where he got those photos to the extreme of saying, this is a photo that I own, right? And I have it on my desk all the time. I look at it all the time. In other places, he says, oh, I own the whole series. But then the photographs in Tears of Eros in that chapter are from two different series, and he misattributes them. So it is not quite clear how much of this is actually true or not. But what is interesting is a kind of negotiation of, on the one hand, I think these are the maybe two important takeaways from Bataille, on the one hand, reversing the very negative image of these of Chinese cruelty, right, as something that is philosophically inspiring but epiphanic, and on the other hand, his rhetoric is really one of thinking about, on the one hand, direct contact, right? This impacted me, right? This has had a real impact on my life, and to reflect and multiply mediate and circulate these images, right? When you say, oh, this is an image that you have to view, right, in privacy, intimately, right? And he imagines that this would have been the image that the Marquis de Sade would have, really relished seeing, but of course he didn't have it. But then on the other hand, you reproduce these images in a book that will circulate widely, right? So there are so many contradictions in that strategy. But it's a very interesting case. And I have, think, to simplify things, I think not given that case a lot of space here. But it's very interesting. Yes, please.
I have to confess being troubled by something in the presentation, not by what you say, but by something that you don't say.
Yeah.
And that is that you have voices in the presentation from contemporary Chinese diaspora. You have voices in the presentation from the Republican era and from the late imperial era.
Yes.
You have an anti-colonial discourse and a discourse against the Western gaze embedded in that. You have a critique of kind of traditionalism and imperial tradition. You have a critique of the nationalists to which you relate. Also in that, what is missing is any discussion of the Malaya Eros or any reflection on it. And this is a regime that, on the one hand, mounted exhibitions of the cruel punishments of imperial China and of the Republican regime. Exhibitions that toured China, that people were invited to visit because they celebrated what the revolution was going to bring, a new age. It's also a regime that mounted a traveling expedition after the suppression of the Tibetan rebellion in 1959 of cruel Tibetan punishments and Tibetan barbarians as a justification for the kind of new civilization that was going to be brought to Tibet. On the other hand, it's a regime that embraced cruelty in other forms and elevated mass participatory public spectacles of cruelty and violence through struggle meetings and public executions of So where does that fit in?
Yeah.
Why are there no PRC voices or discussions of PRC's cruelty and violence and the discourse of violence?
Yeah.
In the memory archaeology?
Okay, I think the simple answer, which is not maybe a very good one, right, is one of the focus of the work I'm doing here. Since this is part of a culturally comparative project, right, since I already, right, deal with the circulations between Chinese cultural spheres, Europe, and then also Latin America, I really have to restrict and limit that circulation to one trope, namely Ling, right? Rather than opening it up to a wider representation of a kind of genealogy of violent execution throughout, say, modern China, understood in a broad way, right, modern, and then thinking about the very, very interesting ways in which different types of violence get erased or underpinned and for specific ideological reasons, right? So that's the kind of like maybe easy way out of answering. One other way of maybe engaging, at least indirectly, with your question would be to wonder about Mo Yan's return to the semi-colonial period and to the way in which that maybe circumvents, but maybe also indirectly addresses some of that violence in a Chinese tradition, right? Because Mo Yan, after all, doesn't negate that this is a violent Chinese tradition. It's just not, it's a tradition that, however, comes about by interconnections with a whole global set of power, right? So we could maybe even read some of the Maoist violence in that way. And then, of course, right, and in a way, right, that kind of reading would be underpinned by looking at some of the early pieces by Yu Hua, which very clearly connect traditional punishment methods of the Chinese pre-modern penal codes to the violence of the Cultural Revolution. So I think there is a way of bringing it in. I just don't know if it would be a detour from the kind of focus on a specific practice of execution that has been circulated. But thanks for your question. Yeah. Yes, please. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's again, right, I think that maybe brings me back to partially to my answer to the very first question. It's very difficult to reconstruct any of that. Of course, when you just, bringing it back to the realm of representations of Ling, there have been especially Western texts which are very engaged in presenting the executioner figure as a figure that relishes in his responsibility and duty. And this is very clearly something that Mo Yan in the Sandalwood death also resurrects, right? Where it's really about a glorious tradition of Chinese punishment that is almost on its way out since modernity is, dawning upon China. Again, I think these, in a way, this is a kind of discourse of ventriloquism, right? And Mo Yan very clearly does it in that way, since the executioner is given a voice. He recounts some of those scenes and relishes them. But it's a construction, again, for very, very specific ideological aims. You could also construct the figure of the executioner as the victim, in a way, right, of somebody pushed into that kind of social function by certain circumstances. You can really sort of push it in different ways, but this is really a kind of question of ethics, really, that I think exceeds really the scope of what I'm trying to do here, even though you're totally right that I'm trying to engage politics and ethics here, but on the basis of media and literary representations, right, which is the thing I can look at and then speculate a little bit about how these texts might impact us to think differently about the way in which extreme violence is getting circulated. But it, of course, it leaves out a lot of real questions about responsibility, about agency, about victimhood. Yes?
I've got a conceptual question for you. Picking up on a comment you made at the end, characterizing the two texts that you're reading as, in some sense, providing for you something like a theory, right? And I guess I'm intrigued by that formulation, which I've seen in your work before. And I guess in particular because I've become increasingly aware of how many artistic productions, primary text productions, are in some sense conceived or conceivable as a kind of a priori resistance to theory or theorizing, right? And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what the stakes are for you conceptually in imagining works of something like art as theoretical conceptualized.
Absolutely. This is a tough question, a very good one, and I don't think I have the ideal answer to it. I have some ideas, right? Why am I interested in going that route? Because I think we have to cut through the difference between theory and examples and illustrations that is so often set up, where especially the dividing line between what counts as theory and what counts as illustrative examples is often, again, a maneuver that reestablishes cultural difference, right? Maybe in blunter terms, right, where theory is supposedly French and German theory, or maybe American theory, and then the examples you can, take from Chinese literature, if you want to, right? And then you can do two things. Either the examples are perfect illustrations of theory produced elsewhere, or they are counterexamples, and so they make really neat little exceptions to the theoretical frameworks we have. I try to read texts in a strong way as their own theories, and thus then think about the making of theory, the construction of theory in a more capacious, more open way. Now, the problem about that is, of course, that that threatens to reduce text to a theoretical statement. So in other words, right, I want to maybe ventriloquize a certain theory through those texts. That is a real danger and problem, but then on the other hand, I feel maybe not troubled enough about this, because I think that this is what we're doing all the time, right? When we select texts, when we bring them into context, especially in intercultural movements, we always use those texts in a specific way. Maybe we're going to have a better way of using them at some point, or maybe somebody else has. At this moment, I feel that pushing back against some of the more universalizing theory making through texts that do not come out of that theoretical tradition, but are not alien to that tradition either, right? For example, Chen dialogues with the book by Bourgon and Ling, right? So, and he very clearly has read some of the Bataille in which the photograph comes up, right? So it's a kind of circulation of theory that is also beyond what we normally think of how theory operates. So I think on the one hand, I'm authorized to do that, right, by saying these are really things inspired by certain theoretical problems. Right? In Moyen's case, it's maybe less clear, but there is certainly a kind of statement against a Western tradition of the novel, right? So we would have to maybe explicate that a little bit more. On the other hand, I still hope that even though those readings are mine, and so the framing of these texts is mine, I still give them some voice to speak to us about something beyond just their own realm of text, right? Something that, as readers, inspires us to maybe think differently when we encounter other texts. Yes, please.
At an earlier period than you're working with, for instance, the story of the Emperor Wen of the Han Dynasty's abolition of mutilated puppetry circulated quite broadly. And then as the relationship between Europe and China changed, they made use of this stuff. Anyway, I was curious if you can briefly say what kind of Latin American stuff you use.
Yeah. So mostly some texts in the 1960s, especially by Salvador Elizondo. He has a novel called Farabeuf, The Chronicle of an Instant, and then also a well-known novel by Cortázar, Rayuela, which is translated as Hopscotch. Salvador Elizondo's novel, whereas in Hopscotch it's just like a little scene of somebody in France gazing at a series of Ling photos, and he intentionally gets it all wrong and sort of rewrites that in an interesting way. Salvador Elizondo constructs a very, very experimental novel all through this photograph, right? And he was, of course, inspired by this photograph through Bataille. So a lot of the circulation happens through Bataille, through an intellectual Latin American diaspora in France in the 1960s. But then there's actually an alternative route of circulation through visual culture, especially painting, where we have relatively early Spanish painters who paint, somebody like Solana, right, who paint from the photographs, right, repaint those scenes, and then that also circulates to Mexican painters also in the 1960s, and this is something that Elizondo is also familiar with. So it's already, so it brings in a different medium, painting, right, and experimental novel, and it's a multiply say, refracted kind of tradition. What I'm also interested in, and this is how this whole chapter begins, is how in Bataille's work, it's not only Chinese execution that is this prime example, but in a lot of his earlier texts, it's Aztec sacrifice. So he takes like the prime examples of cruelty, on the one hand from China, on the other hand from Latin America, and Elizondo, right, if we think about his rewriting of violence, he does it through the Chinese tradition, through the Chinese example, not the Latin American example, right? So he doesn't circulate back to the prehistory of his own culture. He's Mexican, and in the 1960s, there was quite a movement of recuperating some of the pre-Columbine cultures and featuring some of the sacrificial scenes, etc., both in literature and in painting, was really something extremely prevalent, right? So I'm interested in why that unequal kind of circulation, right? Why not a reflection on different margins through the violent circulations of these scenes that come from Latin America and from China? But it's a rerouting through China again to reposition Elizondo very squarely within a European Western tradition. But then, of course, you could also say that for an experimental novel, having a medium such as photography and not, say, Aztec codices, right, is probably more interesting. So this is some of the movement.
Offhand, I would expect it. I can't think of any example of exaltation between Chinese culture. But there's also, we know for the late practices, they would love before he went under Poststructuralist execution. Also kill him quite early.
Yeah.
And so Bataille's idea that the long process of exaltation.
He was interested in the instant, right? So he was interested, and Elizondo was very, very interested in the combination of pain, ecstasy, and drugs. He has one article one early essay that really talks about, it's about morphium, right? It's about opium, basically. And Ling features quite significantly. Elizondo actually learned some Chinese, but he's very fond of an interesting ideographic reading that completely misses the mark. Right? So, for example, he reads in that article Mafe, right, the kind of phonetic transliteration of morpheum as the word for opium, and then he constructs Fei through, which is in a way, right, a phonetically used character in that instance as a reflection on Fei, right, on non-being. Right? So, interesting, very productive misreadings. I think, did I miss somebody else who was? No, okay, yeah, please.
I have a question because it seems like we're talking about the issue with contemporary, relative
Yeah.
contemporary context, right? But it's coming from the imperial period. So we've almost assumed, in particular, like the contemporary setting of the
Yeah.
that we sort of don't go far enough to offer a sense of what we're
Mhm.
especially thinking about returning and the larger community about the violence is sort of
Mhm.
there but not articulated, so hiding between the lines
Mhm.
where nobody knows. And it just struck me that the term lynch is, I mean, it's a terrible punishment, it's an extreme punishment, but it's also sort of stock language traditionally, and it's often a punishment in a play or a story for someone who's done something wrong. It's sort of terrible, but not in that way. So for that kind of thing, you have to go to Mulan or and Hell, where it's not that term. There's something else that's giving you the experience that we're having when we see this punishment, and it actually has nothing to do with something like that. So, is there any way to think with the Chinese text, or coming from the work that literature is doing before it seems quite so extreme, and when it sometimes seems like the punishment that takes the
Right. Yeah. With everything you do in modern Chinese culture, you can, I think, go back to prehistory that is like hundreds of years, right, old, and that's extremely productive. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't look at the history and genealogy of this. Again, I think my easy answer or easy way out is to say, I can't do this kind of work and still think about the conceptual focus here, which really is about intercultural circulation of those representations. But I mean, it would be extremely interesting to think about the diachronic intercultural circulation of this, right? Absolutely. It's not the kind of work I can do, right? Or I could with a lot of research, but it's not something that fits in this chapter. Right? But if you have any suggestions for me to read up on some of that and at least maybe put in a footnote, which is kind of also partly honest, partly dishonest strategy of circumventing some things you should be engaging with, then I'd be very happy to get those suggestions. And maybe this is a kind of work you can do, right? Rather than I. But you're totally right. I mean, that's also one of the things with comparative work, right, which is scary and in a way exhilarating at the same time, because you put some things together and then each of these then, right, comes with 10,000 other things that you would have to explore, right? And so you're basically going down 3 or 4 different alleys, and at some point you just have to say, okay, this is not what I'm doing, right? I have to stop. This is the scope of what I'm doing. Realizing full well that that's a very, very arbitrary decision. I'm not as much troubled by it because for me it's really about a conceptual argument. It's also about, of course, doing justice to culturally specific material and its textuality, if you so want, its specificity. Yes. Sure. And beyond, yeah. 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 But actually,
In that movie, it was very much like the Taiwan. That one is very close to the movie, but in the movie, it was really, really Taiwan. And then there's
yeah.
very strong about the shoe.
Yeah.
The shoe actually is a symbol of the Taiwanese bell. We call it number two. Okay? And then so I realized, I just realized that, and I hit myself, and I realized that maybe this is a symbol. It's kind of tell us how suffer his life. That he lived as a white man.
Okay.
He lived as a child, son, that his father and his neighbors looked at him. What we call Chinese, or the Taiwanese, or sometimes they
Yeah.
CIA. They are in Taiwan. They work in China. And they announced the relatives in Taiwan that they were relatives there. And they do that. So children then have the idea about what I see and what I feel is not true. But we suffer. And we he always has such strong view, big like American. Things American nature.
Yeah.
In culture, in environmental, in whatever, make us, make us capitalism and without the technology to invest to become real fully developed country. So he was a lot of this thinking. And then in my opinion, you always see that those women are bystander. Because how can you take that picture? And then the suffering is
I mean, there are so many ways in which you can read this, and I definitely did focus on a very specific aspect of that it resonates with a lot of references and political discussions about Taiwan, the relationship between Taiwan and PRC, the relationship between Taiwan and other colonial or semi-colonial pasts, or maybe semi-colonial imperial presence. That's also, I think, very well taken. Yeah, I think, again, right, one would have to write a whole book on Chen Chieh-jen, right? I'm not really interested in, I'm not so interested in his like overall political agenda, I have to say, but it is of course relevant. Thank you.
Professor Bachner, long enough. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for extremely insightful comments and questions.